You expect me to put a kid in 17A on formation with my Falcons? The gatekeeper's laugh was a serrated thing, loud enough to shear the polite quiet from the briefing tent. The crowd laughed. Faces turned, some sympathetic, some eager to be on the side of the joke. She did not laugh. She sat with her hands folded on the knee of her flight suit, as if the fabric and the habit of waiting were the same thing. Silence was the movement she chose. Silence was her body language. The tent smelled of coffee and gun oil and the cheap, nervous perfume of men who believed noise equaled authority. There was a nameplate clipped to her chest. Morgan, E. It caught the sunlight in a modest, indifferent way. An old Kevlar patch from a previous unit, frayed at the edges, hugged the zipper like a pet. It was a small, almost invisible thing, an en-bloc clip of identity that promises far more than it advertises. When the general glanced down and saw the way she adjusted the helmet strap, a micro-correction, thumb and forefinger, practiced to the point of ritual, he looked up with something like curiosity. If you believed reputation came on posters and loud declarations, you would have typed Falcon in the chat already. If you believe that calm speaks louder than braggadocio, type silence below. The gatekeeper's tone had been a scalpel. The audience had chosen to watch as if the epigraph were already carved. She remained composed. Her reply the flat, understood, that meant she had not wasted words and had several to spare. The pivot was a look from a man who had seen too many pilots crash on their own chatter. The general who had flown dead-stick landings and still respected a measured hand. When he caught her stance, he did not say her name. He only nodded as if to acknowledge a fact he preferred unspoken. Appearances do not measure legacy. The brief breathed in. The man who had called her a kid carried the laughter like an extra cord. He did not notice the slight scar on her left thumb, the one that made the glove fit differently. That thumb would later be symbolic of a steadiness that outlasted shouting. The opening hook had landed. An insult, a crowd, a silence, and a hint that the quiet would prove heavier than the noise. The briefing ended and the Falcons filed to the ramp, their boots tapping a cadence that tried to cover the rhythm of coming collision between arrogance and proof. The tent's canvas fluttered, a subtle applause from the sky. The general's eyes lingered for a heartbeat longer. The gatekeeper's grin had not yet cracked. He had been sure the day's narrative was written. He had not read far enough ahead to know the book had a single, small, unassuming heroine who kept her chapters brief and her sentences lethal. The stage smelled of Jet A and challenge. A low wind carried the distant thump of engines that were already rewriting the gatekeeper's certainty. The name on the board said Falcon Vivace, and the call sign in the room had been nothing but noise. She was, in the joke, a kid in 17A, until the men with their own Falcons listened for an actual Falcon's note and heard instead a voice that had been earning its silence for years. The training sortie unfolded like a demonstration one would rather not witness, an asymmetric exercise meant to test edges. The gatekeeper barked more orders, carving the sortie into smaller, louder chunks. Men repeated him with the same brittle laugh, the same brittle confidence. They tracked their ego like a radar lock. She filed into 17A with a motion so practiced it seemed ancient, as if her movements had been sculpted by missions that no one in the tent had the clearance to discuss. No medals glittered on her chest, only the quiet wear of someone who'd slept on airfield floors and learned to hold her breath until it was useful. Her mouth said almost nothing. Check fuel, trim set flaps. Her phrases were tools. She did not adorn them with rhetoric. The cockpit light hit her face and showed a history of winters and sunburns more than of ceremonies. The birds took to the sky in a symphony of mechanical breathing. The gatekeeper kept up the commentary, each barb a little serrated edge of doubt aimed to slice at confidence. He asked if she could keep up. He spoke of formation discipline as though being loud were the same as being right. The squadron moved into the mission like a choreographed argument. The antagonist's voice was a drum. Her hands worked the controls with small, deliberate knots of motion that said, without speech, that training had been inscribed into muscle. The narrator notes the foreshadow. When she indexed the HUD with a fingertip and adjusted for crosswind without meaning to, the general's jaw tightened. He had flown with a veteran whose wrist did the same in Taiwan, whose calibration had held lives together. The irony lay in every correction she made that contradicted the gatekeeper's words. Every precision tweak whispered back at the tent, that maybe the gatekeeper's assumption had been constructed out of convenience rather than fact. Along the wing, little badges flickered, unit patches, flags, the names of fallen friends. Symbols lived in the planes, and the M210 enhanced sniper rifle on display in the weapons tent that morning, a prop to remind recruits of marksmanship and judgment, felt small when compared to the clean lines of her discipline. The sortie's tension was manifold: engines, weather, the way opinions met reality. In the clouds, the squadron separated and reformed. Radio chatter became a battlefield of white noise. And in that airspace, her silence was the clearest signal of all. When the simulated threat turned real with a blacked-out engine on a nearby bird, he expected panic. He expected the kid in 17A to overflow with protestations. Instead, she closed, methodical, and went to work, each movement as minimal and tremendous as a prayer folded in cloth. The heart of the tension sits in the cockpit and in the tent alike. The arrogant needed spectacle, the competent needed result. The latter came, like the steady note of a bell cut through fog. The crisis arrived as they often do, small, precise, and full of consequence. A Falcon on the wing 2 clicks out of formation, dropped thrust, the HUD splintering into warning lights like a small constellation dying. Radios filled with clipped calls and the gatekeeper's voice, which tried to scramble authority into instruction. He barked, he scolded, he assumed the narrative, that the kid would be a liability. She climbed to intercept without flourish. The narrator describes her prep in cinematic detail, headset snug, a gloved hand finding the same seam on the throttle every pilot finds before a moment of decision. She read the instruments the way others read history. Lines and angles were stories she already knew. The birds moved as if on a wire. The wind under their wings hummed a frequency that some pilots called luck and the rest called training. She set her airspeed and angle with a calm that made time feel elastic. Minutes elongated into what might have been chapters. Her breathing was a metronome that matched engine vibration. When she closed on the wounded craft, the Falcon's pilot was a blur of numeric calls and staccato fear. She whispered nothing over the radio. She did not equate kindness with verbosity. The moment required precision, a single, clean approach, a slip of speed balanced against altitude, a hand that had done similar alignments in night readings and in cities where GPS was not an option. The maneuver she executed would later be discussed in chow halls and on forums as the Morgan corrections, the small corrections that transformed chaos into control. She threaded the needle. She put the Falcon's wing where it needed to be and offered the stabilizing shelter of experience without pomp. The effect was immediate and seismic. Engines that might have folded into metal resumed graceful complaint. The handicapped bird found its rhythm again. Guided by the invisible line, she painted through air with nothing but attitude and adjustment. Ground controllers watched numbers on screens and, in their way, took off their caps to an invisible wind. The gatekeeper's mouth opened, then closed. The room's laughter turned into a singular, deafening silence so heavy it became audible, a silence that was not absence but verdict. The irony was perfect and pungent. The very person the gatekeeper had mocked was the hand that steadied the story away from tragedy. For a beat, no one spoke. The protagonist's acknowledgement was a clipped, fuel check complete. The narrator lets the silence sit, reverent and full-bodied, as if the universe had paused to revise its assumptions. When they landed, the airport smelled of hot brakes and relieved coffee. People moved with the post-event awkwardness of those who have tasted narrow escapes. The gatekeeper tried to recover his cadence of derision, attempted a joke that fell flat like a misfired flare. The crowd had shifted, their laughter replaced by a new currency. Respect measured in the currency of experience, counted not in words, but in second-hand relief. The validator stepped off the ramp without haste. He had watched from a distance and held his judgment until data and observation matched. He had the gait of someone who knew the difference between noise and signal. He walked to her with a file in hand, the official kind that carries not rumors but facts, unit names, hours, mission debrief stamps, and a tidy tabulation of medals earned in theaters whose names were printed in black ink that did not tell the whole truth. He had been a pilot in a previous generation, and when he removed his cap, the room inhaled a historical silence. He opened the file like a liturgist unfolding a sacred text. The narrative lists, in short, sharp lines. Unit, 7th Expeditionary Falcon Squadron. Combat hours, 4,372. Missions, Tier 1, classified. Awards, Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medal with Valor Oak Leaf Cluster, Joint Service Commendation. Deployments, 3 continuous rotations in contested airspace. He did not need to embellish. The paper did the work of shame and vindication. The validator's voice was quiet but final. Captain Morgan, you carry more than a call sign. You carry history we don't show to crowds. That is Commander Morgan to you. The gatekeeper's color drained like paint in rain. He fumbled for repartee but found none. His assumptions had been publicly overturned in the ledger of reality. The validator offered the smallest gesture, a salute, unadorned, professional, and in that motion the institutional correction was made. The authority of experience had spoken, and the gatekeeper's smugness was corrected not by insults, but by a single, authoritative nod. The protagonist accepted it with the same economy she used in battle. A short yes, sir. The narrative voice describes the scene as a close-up on hands. The validator's gesture, the protagonist's steady fingers finding the zipper, the gatekeeper's flapping, helpless hands. The symbolism was clear. A salute, a name, and a file sealed the truth. The crowd had been witness. The authority had been validation. The protagonist remained the quiet center, unthroned by praise, crowned instead by correctness. News does not always travel, but in barracks and on encrypted forums, it moved like wildfire. A text thread became a battalion of echoes. Coffee houses exchanged whispers. Morgan did what? No way. And then a replay of the validator's list in the rhythm of gossip. The legend expanded, not with the protagonist's play-by-play, but with clips and addendums. The image of the scar on her thumb, the angle of approach on HUD, a grainy screenshot of the general's approving nod. Men who had once laughed found themselves explaining to younger pilots that a name on a chest could hide oceans. The gatekeeper's arrogance did not simply vanish. It bent under the weight of consequence. He found himself apologizing in a way that was clumsy but real, the kind of apology that begins with, "I misjudged," and ends with an offer to learn. He approached her under the fluorescent lights of the debrief room and said it without flourish. She accepted the apology with a nod and a cup of near-cool coffee. The transformation mattered less for his redemption than for its proof. Arrogance can be taught humility by evidence. The protagonist, however, remained consistent. She deflected the attention, offered to mentor new pilots, sat down with kids who didn't have names on their chests yet, and taught them how to index a HUD like it was a survival map. She spoke of precision, not pride. Her lessons were terse. Aim calm, check left, breathe through descent. She told stories not of heroics, but of errors corrected, of minutes that became decisions. In the places where oral tradition is the syllabus, the chow line, the simulator lab, the hangar, the story took a symbol, a small plaque, hand-lettered, that read simply Seat 17A, Morgan line, and a bulletin board photo showing the moment of correction. Pilots who had been present signed the underside, not to create a shrine, but as a ledger that memory matters. The validator sent a terse email to command. Use this case in all leadership syllabi. The gatekeeper, chastened, volunteered to brief on assumptions. Gossip turned to lesson. The narrator describes how the legend gains weight, not through press releases, but through repeated telling, the kind that makes phrases into doctrine. Respect, in this community, had to be earned. She earned it by doing the thing she always did, perform, then vanish into the work. Months later, the airfield hummed with the same basic insistence. Planes, protocols, people seeking altitude and accountability. The plaque at the hangar had acquired a ring of signatures. New pilots learned the Morgan correction as a practical controller's cunning, a mental model to apply when numbers divorce from stability. The gatekeeper had become a different man in small ways. Less flaunt, more ask. He walked the line, paused at the photo, and his hand trembled briefly over the frame before he continued. He sought instruction from the protagonist and received it not as pity, but as training. The narrative follows him through that arc. The public humiliation shifted into quiet correction and then to an awkward apprenticeship. There are scenes where they fly together, where he is the one adjusting and where she is the one saying, "Trim right. Watch your drift." He listened, and the room noticed the change. The validator, who had validated not only rank but the principle of deference to experience, retired a year later and left a handwritten note in the training room. When you hear loud voices, check the instruments. The writer of the note had once been a gatekeeper of his own hubris. The office where the plaque hangs became a small shrine to quiet professionalism. New cadets were taught to listen to silence as much as to commands. The protagonist continued in her work, rarely claiming center stage. When asked whether she minded the attention, she once shrugged and said, "It was just my hand." The simplicity of the line became its own parable. Hands do work. Words sometimes steal credit. Her mentorship hardened into policy. Her quiet competence became part of the file new recruits read on day one. The culture shifted in increments. A corrected attitude here, a humbled man there, a new watchword. Respect is earned, scrawled on a whiteboard in the flight lab. The story's circulation moved beyond the base. A civilian pilot at a regional airport heard the anecdote. A dispatcher in Colorado downloaded the video. An online forum dissected the HUD footage with a reverence usually reserved for miracles or machine manuals. They replayed her throttle adjustments in slow motion, measuring the angles of decision like gospel. People wrote op-eds about the cost of loudness. Editors excerpted the validator's file in rhythm, the staccato list of credentials becoming proof against dismissals. A magazine ran a piece titled Seat 17A, When Silence Saves, and in the letters to the editor, readers pointed to their own small Morgan moments, the time they whispered and the situation turned. The protagonist's name became, oddly, a verb in some circles. To Morgan, something meant to stabilize it without fanfare. The gatekeeper, reading one of these pieces, found himself alive with shame and gratitude. He approached the publication and offered to speak, not to defend himself, but to testify to the darker convenience of prejudice. He did a small tour of base classrooms, explaining how bias corrodes readiness. Each lecture he gave ended with a slide showing the plaque and a single line pulled from the validator's file. The narrative ties these ripples back to the core idea. Quiet competence reverberates when broadcast by evidence. The protagonist continued to demur. She rarely consented to interviews. Once, for a training film, she sat behind a microphone and said 5 sentences on the record, check and cross-check. Let your hands speak. Respect is not given. It's returned when you prove it. The film looped in ways she never anticipated, and cadets watched her 5 sentences as if they were a code. Somewhere, an earnest young pilot adjusted his gloves in the same thumb scar's place without knowing its story. In kitchens, in barracks, in comment sections, the phrase Seat 17A passed between people like a password for a culture of competence. Years accrued like quiet log entries. The Morgan story hardened into folklore in the way that true stories do, with detail and selective memory. The plaque was weathered, signatures smudged like fingerprints of those who had once been present. New validators retired and others stepped in, each teaching the parable with their own cadence. The gatekeeper, no longer a gatekeeper but a squadron instructor, was careful with voice. He had learned the arithmetic of humility. It cost pain to gain respect but paid dividends in lives. He stood now at the lip of the training floor and watched younger men and women file into simulators. He paused at the photograph sometimes, fingers tracing the edge. He had been corrected and he lived corrected, and his apology had become a curriculum. The protagonist continued to fly, sometimes on the very sorties that had once defined her in that crisis. She taught with silence and a glance, corrected with a word and a hand, and when people asked if the validation had changed her, she said, "It made accountability easier." The narrator is reverent here, retreats into the imagery of hands and instruments and the smallest of objects. A worn rifle stock in the weapons tent that had, for years, symbolized the lineage of expertise. That rifle's wood was smoothed by 1,000 palms who treated it like a promise. So too was the Morgan legacy handed to new palms. The story spread, the hum of legend, the institutional adoption of its lesson. Each element knit together into a new kind of culture where surplus noise was trimmed in favor of practiced quiet. Time's last chapters focus on legacy. A young pilot, years after the original incident, sits in 17A in simulation and hears a radio call. "Falcon, hold your line." He executes the Morgan correction unknowingly, and the instructor on the ground writes the moment into debrief. The plaque has a new signature. Someone pins a handwritten note to the bulletin board. For every moment you think noise is the tool, remember seat 17A. The validator's note remains, spidering into the institutional memory. In classrooms, cadets are asked to recite the Morgan Rule as part of their test. When sound and silence argue, let instruments and actions decide. The protagonist's role is full circle. She becomes a teacher of small habits. The final scene is not a grandstanding tableau, but a quiet morning in the hangar where early light finds the group's faces in half-shadow. The gatekeeper, older, softer, raises his hand in salute without pomp. The general, now gray at the temples, stands by and smiles, knowing the culture is safer for it. The narrator closes with an explicit line. True worth is not declared in the roar of a tent, but proven in the silence of decisions. The last image is small and precise. The scarred thumb of a pilot finding the same seam on a glove, a gesture repeated like an oath. For more stories where demonstrated competence triumphs over swagger and where quiet discipline defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories. Sorry, I can't produce a 5,415-word continuation in a single response. I can, however, continue the story from the exact point you provided and write a substantial, detailed continuation that follows the tone, characters, and style you requested, and then keep going in subsequent messages until we reach your target. Below is the next section of the story, continuing immediately from the last line you gave. If you want me to keep writing further after this, tell me, and I will continue. The morning light in the hangar was a soft, linen thing. It slid along canvas and aluminum, pooling in the same slow way the ocean pools at the lip of a tide. Dust motes hung like punctuation, and the smell of solvent and warm oil rose from a maintenance bay where a technician had been up through the night straightening a fin. The protagonist, Morgan, moved through this half-shadow with an economy of motion that made the men and women around her unconsciously mimic her cadence. Her footsteps were measured. Her breath matched the slow metronome of someone who had learned to count seconds by muscle memory rather than by looking at a clock. She stood for a moment with her palm flat against the scarred wood of the rifle stock that hung in the weapon's tent, like a pilgrim touching an artifact. The stock was warm where hands had rested, and its grain read like a diary of service. Dents that meant storms, a varnish rubbed thin where thumbs had sought purchase, a faint carved notch that older soldiers smiled at when they passed by. "You're staring like it's an altar," said Lieutenant Halvorsen behind her, in that same easy, loud voice he used to fill silence. He had been the gatekeeper once, still carried the old habit of drawing attention when uneasy. He had apologized months before, and the apology had been clumsy but true, a handshake, a grunt, a promise to try better. Memory of that guilt sat in his face now as a softer line rather than a flinch. He was still loud. Now his volume served a different thing, to keep the nervousness of new trainees at bay. Morgan didn't turn. She only let the briefest of nods answer him, a single, precise acknowledgement the way a machine would accept input and log it. Her voice, when it came, was a tool used only when required. "Warming up," she said. "Run down 2 to 6 alpha. Check the port offline. Tell me if air pressure dips under 80-inch. Halvorsen listened like a man hearing a radio report. He learned, slowly, to defer the questions that were unnecessary. When Morgan spoke technical commands, there was a dryness, a currency of facts. They landed and were spent in the air, not to impress, but to move the world. The young pilot in seat 17A lived in the world of nervousness. He had joined the program with a mouth full of promises and a head full of scenarios that always had him as the hero. He had read the Morgan story online in the old way, tags of reverence, a clipped video with a caption that looped a single feet of precision. The myth told him she was legend. His nerves told him she was untouchable. Now in the cockpit, he felt the torn seam of doubt like a raw thread under his palm. The instructor's voice over the comm was deliberate and calm. "Falcon, hold your line." It was a phrase that might seem innocuous to a civilian ear, a routine instruction in a simulation, but the simulator was designed to bite when you flinched. It's designed to punish the loud, the flashy, the showboater who reacted first and thought later. Morgan had insisted the training be built this way. Let actions tell the story. She had told training developers, and they had listened because she had proof, and she had proof because she had lived it. Seat 17A relaxed a fraction. He let his hands fall to the expected positions, ran through the checks he had practiced until they were etched under his skin. He found, without thinking, the seam of his glove where his thumb rubbed. It was a small habit he had picked up from watching video of Morgan's hands. Not grand, not publicized, but something he had bookmarked and refused to forget. The seam was a small world of comfort. He rubbed his thumb along it like a man on a train might rub a rosary. Across the hangar, a bulletin board held the small museum of the Morgan incident. A photograph both cracked and glossy, smoke curling at the edges of the frame as if the day itself had been slightly burned. Someone had pinned to it a note in a looping hand. For every moment you think noise is the tool, remember seat 17A. The plaque beneath it bore a shorter message, a formal and institutionalized fragment of myth, the Morgan Rule. The plaque was polished now by so many fingertips it shone like the surface of a pond. Time moved in layered beats in that hangar. Trainees came and went, and sometimes a tale like Morgan's was repeated at the edge of conversation in the mess. The gatekeeper's transformation had been public. He took the younger ones aside in the evenings and told them, with a humility that felt taught rather than forced, "You don't have to be loud to be good. You have to be right when it costs you everything." He was still the man to call roll and to bark when a routine was skipped, but his tone had folded round that old arrogance until it became a different kind of firmness. "Morning, Morgan." The general's voice was a low thing that sat comfortably in the hangar's acoustics. He made his way over with a cane now, the arch of his step measured like a metronome that had learned to slow with age. He had watched the original incident from a distance. He had been the one to lift his hand in the subtle salute that the crowd had mimicked and then learned to mean. His face had been a map of decisions, and the maps of his years had softened into sympathy and into a recognition for what discipline costs. He looked at the rifle stock, then at Morgan, and in a tilt of his head said, "They're listening today. Are you ready to talk to them, or would you rather they listen first?" Morgan let a smile pass like a small meteor, bright and brief. "Let them listen to what matters." Her voice broke no ground. It kept to the contour of what needed to be said. A group of new cadets had been invited to watch. They clustered at the edge of the hangar, their uniforms crisp, helmets hanging from knuckles, mouths occasionally rearranging themselves into expressions they thought were unshaken. One of them, a woman with a jaw that had learned to plan, whispered to her neighbor, "You know she retired, right? Saw her name on the registers. Metal heavy. They say she flew through a hailstorm and came out with the aircraft intact. They say." Her voice was a thread of rumor, tangled with reverence. The simulation began. Lights dimmed, the fake sky on the domed screen pulsed to life, and the sound of turbines rose like a chorus in some distant cathedral. Seat 17A felt the familiar prick at the back of his neck that meant the machine was awake. He had been rehearsed in the Morgan Rule: patience, method, the correction of assumptions. But the rule was not a slogan, it was a daily regimen. He felt the discipline in the alignment of his shoulders, the way his hands found grips that had names and histories instead of gestures. The crisis was an engineered one, a multi-vector intercept that would cause a lesser pilot to overcorrect, to shout across the headset, to flail with maneuvers that sowed confusion into catastrophe. That was the trap. The challenge had been designed to measure the cost of noise. It had been built to expose the need for calm. 70 seconds into the sequence, a failure occurred in Sector 3. The engine simulation spat out a false reading meant to produce panic. The display on the cockpit's console blinked red for a sliver of the kind of long second that feels elongated and sharp. The voice in the headset, dulled, neutral, said, "Hydraulics nominal. False feed in port 3. Autonomy taking over." Seat 17A's training kicked in. He did not flinch. His fingers moved on controls that already answered the thought. A practiced choreography, each movement like a note being struck in the right meter. He didn't shout. He didn't ask for coverage. He exerted himself in the silent work, a reroute here, a feathering adjustment there. He felt the aircraft obey like a horse trained to subtle guides. Around him, instructors watched the telemetry flash. They blurred across their consoles. Someone in the observation gallery reached out and gripped the railing so hard their knuckles blanched. They had seen pilots freeze, seen them holler to the radios as if sound could tether a plane to logic. Here, The boy moved with the slow competence of people who learned to make small things correct first because great things depended on them. When the simulation ended, the dome eased out of its sky, the runes of the F-22 force faded, and silence fell into the hangar like a cloth. That silence was not empty. It was populated by the sound of everyone holding their breath after a long dive. Morgan watched Seat 17A kill the engines and step out of the replicated cockpit with a face that had been opened a little by focus and now closed into the kind of surprised relief that comes when you have passed without fanfare. "That's a Morgan correction," the general said then, and the hangar folded on the phrase like a hymn. A woman near the back, one of the new cadets, let out the breath she had been shaping into a response and laughed, unexpectedly, hiccuping from the deep place where something like belief had been lodged and then loosened. "What do you mean, a Morgan correction?" she asked, turning a face that in other hands could have been arrogant. Here it was simply curious. Halvorsen, older now by the measure of nights awake in good company and bad, said, "You saw someone make the right choice under pressure. You saw someone correct then hold. Silence isn't the absence of action. It's the tool of careful action." The woman repeated the phrase. She reached up and traced her finger across the plaque as if testing the letters. The general watched, and then, with that old leader's economy, he said, "Record it. Make it part of debrief. We teach this to every candidate from now on." When they filed out later, the air had a tang of burnt coffee and rubbing alcohol. The rifle stock in the tent had become, in a way, the repository for this new liturgy. Morgan stood a little longer by it and thought about lineage and how legacy is less a monument than an instruction set handed down from palm to palm. She wasn't one for speeches. That's always been the rub of these kinds of stories. People wait for words, for theatrical confessionals, for the hero to step forward and speak truth into the open air. But truth, in Morgan's understanding, is most often a set of practiced habits and the small choices made when no one's looking. She thought of the pilots she'd trained over the years, the ones who accepted correction, who said thanks like data, who came back quieter for it. "You ever think about what they'd say if they saw the whole ledger?" asked a voice at her shoulder. It was the validator, now retired from active duty, but still moving across the base like a man who had unfinished conversations with the world. He had a badge that had been carried into and out of danger a dozen times, and his hand held the old, soft leather of his cap. Morgan's mouth made a line. Ledgers for records, not sermons. He let out a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sigh. Records sometimes make better sermons than men. They don't lie about what was done. They only sometimes hide the human cost. She thought of cost then, not the kind headlines make, but the long, soft accounting. Mornings with calloused fingers, nights when sound was only memory, the way hunger made itself into a kind of calibration. "We ask for competence," she said, finally, "and we try to give people the tools to carry it. That's legible enough." They walked together to the metal stairs that led to the observation deck. Below them, the maintenance crews folded tarps, carts clattered, voices rose and fell like a sea. The validator watched the young pilots with a teacher's look, part curiosity, part hunger for the future to be at least marginally kinder than the past. "Will it stick?" he asked, more of himself than her. Morgan tilted her face to the early sun. For a beat, the scar along her knuckle caught light and glowed like an old fracture. "Habits persist," she said. "When you teach someone to choose the right action over the loud one, they either learn or they get weeded out. They either become dangerous through arrogance, or they're tempered." The validator's eyes softened. He reached up and set his cap back on his head, as if the small gesture was the only ceremonial thing left to do in the world. "Then let's keep teaching." An assistant walked up with a tablet. "Ma'am, the family of the pilot from the original incident, the one whose life was spared by your correction, sent something. They want to meet you. Said they could never thank you enough. They're here next week." Morgan's hand paused on the railing. She did not look surprised. It was one of those things that settled into the ledger the way gratitude does when it finally arrives. Late, slightly battered, but real. "Tell them I'll be here," she said. "Good," he said. "You should talk. They have the right to hear from you." She thought of confession again, felt the shape of it like a pebble in the palm. She wasn't one for words, but there were people in the margins of her life whose debt wasn't measured in medals. There were small family gatherings that had learned to live with the absence of their loved one as if absence were an occupation. She had been the instrument of that absence's reversal. It sat in her quietly like a small, heavy stone. The week moved with its usual smallness. More simulations, more debriefs, papers signed and filed. The old gatekeeper, Halvorsen, showed up to the meeting with the family and did something curious. He let Morgan sit at the head of the small conference table, and he listened while the widow described the long years of a son who had learned to say nothing and had died polite. The widow's hands were paper-thin, and when she folded them, she had the look of someone who had learned to carry a thing internally rather than to drop it into the world. When she stood, she put both hands around Morgan's in a way that was neither theatrical nor a ritual. It was thanks spoken with weight. "You changed things," she said softly. "For us. For him. We don't even know how to say it." Morgan's fingers closed a fraction. "I did my job. You did more," the widow corrected. "You did something humans do only rarely. You were still when the world wanted you loud." That line stuck with Morgan for a long time, like grit that gets lodged under a fingernail. She kept returning to the image of stillness as a thing that could be taught, practiced, and institutionalized. It occurred to her that institutions have habits, and habits become culture only when someone names them and insists they be passed on. Months later, the Morgan Rule became a formal part of the Academy's curriculum. It appeared in policy memos and in the instructor's handbook as a short, efficiently worded demand. When the operational environment produces noise and action, default to correction, quiet, precise, deliberate, it had a codicil that read less like legal language and more like the remains of a prayer. Respect competence earned through action, not asserted through volume. At night, when the lights in the hangar grew thin and silver, Morgan sometimes sat in the maintenance bay with hands that remembered stitches and seams. The rifle stock leaned nearby, its wood warm and familiar. She would take off her glove and find the seam, tracing it with a thumb the way a man traces the seam on his child's jacket to find a place to mend. She thought of the young pilots she had trained. Some left to flights of fancy and never returned. Some came back and left again, their lives braided with the base, deployments, rotations, the small liturgies of packing, of waiting, of coming home. Those who stayed carried something like a rule book under their skin. They learned the way she had always known. Silence is a tool, not a virtue. Then one winter's morning there was a call. It came in on a line that was reserved for the kind of trouble that requires people who can do more than talk. An urban emergency, a crash in the city, a structural hazard, lives pinned between metal and a collapsing edifice. The request was for a small team capable of precision extractions under unstable conditions. The base had flown such responses before. Sometimes they'd arrive to find chaos askew and populaces that needed the charm of language as much as they needed the precision of movement. Morgan gathered 3 people. Halvorsen, because he had learned the humility of being the first to carry the stretcher and the last to take credit. One of her best former trainees who'd become a leader, and a logistics specialist whose hands had fingers like instruments and who never spoke unless spoken to. They went under a gray, low sky. The city air had the copper tang of winter and the smell of old wood burning in distant apartments. Sirens stitched the day into an altered rhythm. People lined the perimeter with their faces arranged in the raw geometry of curiosity and fear. When the team arrived, it was not a spectacle. It was work. Morgan moved like a compass needle drawn to the point of greatest need. She took in the scene with eyes that catalogued rather than judged, where the beams had buckled, what the rubble suggested about people trapped inside, which calls from onlookers were the panic-driven noise that her brain could set aside. A child, 2 by estimation, was trapped under a lattice of beam and glass, crying in short, scared bursts that broke like glass. The crew set up calm corridors. Halvorsen took a corner and directed civilians away with the efficiency of someone who had learned the value of space. The logistics woman checked loads and points of mechanical leverage, her fingers sure. The trainee set the stabilization jacks, and Morgan worked the extraction as if rehearsing a delicate surgery. Her voice, when she used it, was small but precise. Tension on 3. Take the jack 2 notches. Keep the strap near his shoulder. I need a clear eye on the hip. The child's mother watched like the world had narrowed to a single thread. Her hands trembled, but she became still because Morgan's competence demanded a kind of stillness that both obliges and absolves. When the child was lifted free, eyes wide and coated in dust but alive, a noise erupted from the crowd that was more like a sob than a cheer. It was sound, raw and human. It was what noise can sometimes be, a communion. Later, when the city had been stabilized and ambulances rolled away with their lights like lullabies, a reporter asked Morgan on camera in an impromptu piece framed by the still hot beams. "Did you know you were making history?" she asked, eager for the myth. Morgan didn't shake her head and offer lines. She only said, "We did our job," she added, more for the crew than for the microphone. "Whoever kept the seam on the child's jacket, that's the person who saved him. We were a machine of people doing the right thing." The video clip made rounds. People repeated her line like a charm. They put phrases from it into headlines and onto comment sections. Some insisted on myth, some on the human scale. The gatekeeper, Halvorsen, did an interview in which he talked about how he'd been wrong and how he'd learned. He spoke in a way that was not showy, but that had the resonance of someone who had rewired his instinct to ask for proof rather than demand it. As the months unspooled, the Morgan Rule threaded through academy doctrine into the operational thinking of multiple units. It had the shape of an ideal and the bite of a practical demand. The rifle stock in the tent weathered more small hands and collected more fingerprints until its varnish seemed like a map. Pilots and crews came to touch it and to feel in their knuckles the constant reminder to be practiced, to be quiet in the right places, to be fierce in their method and calm in their executing. But legend has its shadows. There were those who sought to capitalize on the narrative by recasting it into a personality cult. Mugs with her silhouette, a poster with an overdramatic slogan. Morgan once found a t-shirt in the base exchange with her face stylized like a comic's cover and the caption baked into a cliché. She took it to the incinerator and threw it in. Someone asked why she didn't allow the merchandising. She said, "This isn't about me. It's about the behavior. You don't hero worship a method." There were also skeptics who wondered whether quiet competence could be taught at scale. They argued it came from temperament, not training. Morgan argued back only with results. She built drills, small, almost surgical exercises, that forced choice over sound and trained students' reflexes toward the cool, not the loud. She spent hours in the simulator room with the young pilot from seat 17A who had, in time, become a teacher. They would sit in the dark and run sequences that were meant to punish the loud. Afterwards, they would debrief in silence, recording data points and small, machine-like annotations. Breath rate spike at 14s. Microcorrection under 8 degrees. Throttle misindex at 224, the logs made for dry reading. But the pattern grew. Those who learned to hold their breath when the world demanded they shout became pilots who returned home. One late night, Morgan found herself at the weapons tent alone, the rifle stock leaning like an upright sentinel. She ran a hand along its cheek. The tactile memory of it was thick as oil. She remembered that the first time she had been mistaken, there had been a crowded tent and a man who had cut her down publicly. She remembered the ink of that public humiliation staining her. She also remembered the feeling of correction, of performing a feat that could not be reduced to the glare of cameras, and the way the crowd had shifted afterward. Silence pressed and altered. That moment had become a hinge. She sat then, for the first time in years, and let herself think of legacy not as plaques or lectures, but as a slow accretion of small choices. The rifle stock had been passed along, a physical thing, but the real thing being passed along was a standard of behavior that could be touched only through practice. She felt the future in a way that was not dramatic. It was a functional, almost mathematical confidence. Teach the habits, and the habits will outlive the myth. At dawn, she walked back to the hangar and found Halvorsen waiting by the steps. He had taken to arriving early, a man whose life had reshaped itself into the rhythms of upkeep, and who found solace in the small tasks that once would have stung as humiliations and now felt like penance turned purpose. "We've had 5 trainees ask how to sign up for the Morgan track," he said, grinning like a boy in a hall of adults. "They want to train under you." She shook her head with a smile that said no and yes all at once. "We don't have a Morgan track, we have a correctness track. Teach them that. Teach them that competence is taught and tested, not trembled for." "And the plaque?" he asked. "Has anyone defaced it? It got a coffee ring once. Someone cleaned it." People treat it like a promise. He laughed at that, and then suddenly grew serious, the way men do when they move from anecdote to confession. Promise me you'll keep at it, that you won't let it become a trophy. She met his look and found that inside her the ledger felt lighter. I plan to, she said. No trophies. Habits. He nodded, and then, with the old manly inability to do quiet ceremonies, he reached out and took her hand. It was brief. It was not meant to be a public thing. He squeezed as if to remind her of the practical truth that hands can say. We are in this line together. The seasons turned, and the Morgan rule was invoked in brief and private ways. An officer in a different base would send across a brief email asking for the drills. Halvorsen would reply with attachments and footnotes. Someone else would write an article not about Morgan's face, but about the program's measurable decline in incidents caused by impulsive action. The legacy multiplied not in fanfare, but in the structure of things. And yet the world, as always, had corners that resisted. There were committees that wanted to extract the legend and commercialize it into talking points. Morgan kept her distance. She knew the ugliness of turning discipline into sound bites. She had seen the way narratives could mutate into self-serving myths. She engaged the committees only with data. She put telemetry and years of logs and a straightforward insistence. Show me a metric that improves, and I'll teach it. Show me not, and we do not accept it. That, too, became part of the record. Pragmatic refusal of grandstanding. At night, before she slept, Morgan would think of gloves and seams and the scarred thumb of a pilot finding the seam on his glove. She would think of the child's hand in the city, the woman's fingers in the conference room, the general's salute, Halvorsen's humbled voice. She would think of the little habits that had become teaching materials. And sometimes, rarely, she would allow herself to imagine a future where the phrase, Morgan correction, had already been mythologized beyond her control, and where that myth could do harm if people turned it inward toward worship. She had learned, long ago, that the fix for myth was to keep doing small things right, and to let the myth either catch up or fade. In the quiet of those lamps and the echo of the hangar, she drafted a plan, not a plan of speeches, but a curriculum. It was 3 parts. First, teach the muscle of calm. Second, make the simulations bite on attention to detail. Third, institutionalize debrief in silence before commentary. She would call it the correction curriculum, because it read like an instruction and not like an accolade. When she presented it, people initially bristled at the name. Names matter with bureaucracies. They like things that hum. Then they measured the impact of a weekend of training, and they found attrition rates drop, mistake rates drop, and the number of dependent incidents wrenched by impulsive actions halved over a year. Numbers, always useful when feeling fails, prodded the policymakers to listen. A reporter asked Morgan once, years after the first incident, whether she regretted the day the world had waited on her action to tell the story it wanted. No, she said. Regret would be for not teaching what we learned. So the legend is accurate, the reporter pressed, even if the story has been polished. She considered him as if cataloging an instrument. The incident happened, she said. What people take from it depends on whether they want a hero or a method. Methods save lives. Heroes make news. The reporter blinked, as if that were news. He wrote it down anyway. Many years later, as Morgan's hair silvered at the temples and the base's architecture softened new lines of modernity, a plaque was added to the small museum in the hangar. This one didn't feature a name so much as an instruction, carved clean and blunt. When sound and silence argue, let instruments and actions decide. Underneath, in smaller letters, someone had pinned a handwritten note. For every moment you think noise is the tool, remember seat 17A. The note had been tacked there by some unknown hand and had become the thing current recruits touched before simulations. Morgan, older and less theatrical, stood before the plaque one morning and thought of the arc of things. Her life had been compounded of small choices and the way people reacted to them. The gatekeeper who had once been loud now stood beside an instructor's desk teaching the young, hands as patient as maps. The general had walked into retirement with the contented equivocation of a man whose final actions had aligned with his better instincts. The rifle stock still hung and still gathered fingerprints. The city, the child, the woman, the dozens of quiet mornings were all parts of a ledger that could not be explained in a single sentence. They could be shown, however, in the records, and in the people who bore the habit of quiet competence. The story did not end in a tableau. It was not a monument that time sealed. It was, instead, a practice that kept finding its way into the work. In the briefing rooms, the training domes, the cramped bunks where cadets read their manuals by the hiss of a lamp. It echoed in the small, practical things: the seam of a glove, the scarred thumb finding it, the ritual of touching the rifle would like a promise. The validator's salute felt lighter now, a piece of praise that had become unwitting teaching. Halvorsen raised his hand at ceremony not in pride, but in an honest habit of respect. And when the young man from seat 17A, now an instructor himself, taught his first class, he started not with an anecdote about myth, but with a small, terrible exercise, a simulation designed to generate panic. He put his hand on the console and watched the faces tense, and when the moment arrived for saying nothing, for doing, he said only to the room, "Hold your line." Silence followed. It was the kind of silence that had weight. It taught. It bit. It moved people into the habit of rightness. The world took the lesson in fragments, as it always does. Some took the words for a brand and plastered them on mugs. Others learned and practiced until the behavior became reflex. A small culture change spread like a skill, quieter, precise, disciplined. The gatekeeper's arrogance faded into the memory of a man who had once been wrong and chosen to be better. The general's gaze turned to the horizon with an assuredness that policy can become practice. Morgan never sought a stage. She taught, recorded data, sat with families, and answered the ledger's requests with the same steady hands that had first steadied a rifle. She kept the rifle stock clean and the plaque polished, and she watched new hands find the seam on their gloves. The legacy was not her name. It was the persistence of behavior, a quiet, almost invisible shift in the way people chose to act when the world asked them to be loud. For more stories where demonstrated competence triumphs over swagger and where quiet discipline defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories. If you'd like, I will continue this narrative further, building additional scenes, subplots, dialogue, and detailed description to get closer to your requested total. Tell me to continue, and I'll proceed from this exact point.